Center for the Study of New Media and Society at New Economic School. Continues well, we didn't plan it as a series, but it turned out this is sort of a series of investigative reporters visiting our school and telling us interesting stuff about their work. So Mark Feldstein will have an interesting lecture tonight, and if you, in the beginning, Mark, could tell a couple of words about your experience as a CNN producer and whatever you're holding, all your sort of degrees and stuff. So enjoy. I'm sorry that it's not as many people as we could have hoped for, but enjoy our audience.
Thank you. Thank you. You can all hear me? Yeah. Let me just start by figuring out who I'm talking to. How many of you are professional journalists? Raise your hand. No? Okay, one. All right.
Student journalists.
All right. How many of you are studying journalism? One. And who are the rest of you? Say what? And are you going to be translating, Olga? Or?
No.
Okay, this is all English only, right? Okay. Are you just interested people, or in a class?
Economists.
Economists. Okay.
Political science.
Political science.
Computer science.
Computer science. Big difference.
Political science.
Political science. I don't know if computers think political is a science.
Good one.
Center for Russian Studies. Okay.
English.
English.
No.
You can pay. You don't have to answer. Student. Okay. And all these other ones, are you students, professors, or what? Professor. Okay. All right. Okay. That helps. Thanks. My name is Mark Feldstein. I'm a journalism professor at the University of Maryland in College Park, Maryland, which is just outside Washington, D.C. The belly of the beast. I'm talking too fast. I'll just slow down. Back a little. So I was an investigative reporter for 20 years before I became an academic windbag. I worked at CNN and NBC and ABC, mostly in television, on the air as an investigative reporter. And I like to tell my students, because maybe they'll whine a little less about their grades, that I was beaten, that I was ensued in the United States, that I was censored and detained by authorities in Egypt under the Mubarak regime, and escorted out of the country under armed guard in Haiti, doing investigative exposés that people didn't like. But my stories also led people I investigated to go to prison or to be fired from their jobs if they were apparatchiks, as you call them. We have plenty of them in the United States. And multi-million-dollar fines against corporations. So some, reforms also. And I can talk to you about investigative journalism in the U.S. I brought an old video clip that I usually play for students because I was about their age, as you may have seen, when I did it. And I can show you a couple of websites because there is a growing movement of investigative reporting and transparency now around the globe. And I can show you a couple of links to that, which are kind of interesting. Mostly when I talk, people are most interested in the questions and answers. So I'll ask you to treat this like an American news conference where you just, shout out the question or raise your hand or something, because I don't have a formal lecture really prepared, and I don't want to bore you to death. You wouldn't want to hear it, even if I did. So I'm curious why you're here and what you'd like to know.
Yeah, you said, one of the things you did as an investigative journalist led to results, right?
Right.
But I haven't seen much of that with Wall Street. It seems, there's lots of books out there and there's lots of good investigative journalist pieces, but there doesn't seem to be any follow-up in terms of repercussions or consequences to anything. So that seems to be the main goal of investigative journalism, should be that, but it seems to be missing with the financial crisis.
Yeah, the American press by and large failed when it came to the financial crisis. They failed as a whole in predicting it, reporting about the problems that would lead to the worst recession, depression since the 1920s. And much, if not most, of the coverage, especially on television and these business cable channels, was the opposite, was propaganda, was boosterism about how great Wall Street's doing and where you should invest, and actually helped lead gullible, ordinary Americans to invest their money in places that weren't good bets. And you're right.
So why, do you think?
Why?
Because, you know, like Seymour Hersh with My Lai and some,
Right.
we've had some really good ones, but it
Yep.
seems like they disappeared in the past.
I worked for Cy Hersh briefly in college, and he's you know, a terrific investigative journalist. He does intelligence, national security. Financial news and business news is very complicated. It's very arcane. So that is one obstacle to begin with. I don't think it's terribly sexy. So, for example, television really stays away from it. Television likes visuals. Well, there's nothing less visual just about than a complicated financial or business story. I'm not excusing it. I'm just trying to explain what I think are some of the structural reasons. You know, the titans of Wall Street who were involved in a lot of the misbehavior were pretty respected and influential by the news media. And, you know, there's been criticism that some of these same folks who helped get us into the problem are the ones that the Obama administration has hired to bail us out.
Exactly, right.
So,
Seems like a good story, though.
It's a great story.
For some journalists, but I
And
haven't seen
sadly, I think the most attention I've seen given to it in the mainstream media has been by a comedian, Jon Stewart, who runs a show called The Daily Show. Investigative comedy, if you will. And you know that's a sad statement about journalism when the comedians reach more people about a topic than mainstream journalists. And that's not to say there wasn't some good specialist reporting done, but it didn't really have an impact.
Right.
And I guess you have experience in your society when comedians are the ones that were the truth tellers instead of journalists. So I guess I plead mea culpa on behalf of the press. Not a very satisfying answer, I know. Other questions? I'm open to suggestions, but you know, maybe until Soros or somebody who made their money that way endows a journalism to expose that kind of speculative behavior, you know, it'll continue.
I guess one of the most valuable things is that your experience it consists of many stories, you know, real cases. Maybe just to hear pieces of these stories, maybe you can provide a couple of examples where investigative journalism like really worked and where it failed completely based on what you did all these years.
Okay. Well, I can talk about that in terms of the stories I've done, and I can also talk about it in terms of what's been done in the U.S. I know in my career, only a minority of stories really led to any concrete positive changes. Now, those changes could be significant, as you know, I mentioned talking about prison and fines and so forth. But you know, we are only journalists. We're not prosecutors. We're not legislators. We can't put people in jail. We can't change the laws. And you know, in many ways, it depends on how corrupt the culture is in which you're operating. And I've worked in various different cities and, you know, reported nationally and internationally. And so the audiences are different. And in the more honest places, they respond. In the less honest places, they don't. So just to give you an example, One piece that I was queuing up here was about migrant farm workers. These are poor men, mostly. The ones I looked at were black, African American, mostly illiterate, and they were kidnapped on the east coast of the United States, held against their will, and forced to work in debt, until they paid off their debt, and actually were slaves, and actually sold for cash from one to the other. A rarity, to be sure, in the U.S., but there are still occasional pockets of this. So that story was so obviously, demonstrably awful, and that it led to the people who held them, the crew leaders, the violent crew chiefs, who also beat me up when I tried to interview them about it, and they split my head open. It led them to be sent to prison. That was good. Nothing happened to the corporations that hired these violent crew leaders. Nothing happened at the federal level to the federal apparatchiks who licensed this guy. And that's a good story with some positive results, but still of some limited reform. More often, people shrug their shoulders. And once I did a story where actually the results were worse. I did a story about bribery in Washington, D.C., and we actually videotaped bribes being paid off to get unsafe cars through the auto inspection service. And we had the evidence in black and white, in color actually. The video was in color. And instead of these people going to prison or being fired, they actually were able to charge more money for the bribes because they said all of the attention that we had focused on in our broadcast made it riskier. And so they made more money from my expose than before I did it. So in that case, it actually, I won't say backfired or boomerang because maybe the volume of business went down, but it certainly, kills any illusions you have that, every story is, and the truth is all that's needed for reform to take place. Most investigative reporters try to do their job, try to tell the story, and then move on. And because of the notion of objectivity, would say they don't care what happens. It's not their responsibility other than to report the truth. I think, though secretly, most of us want some reform to happen. And some are more openly advocates, are more openly crusading about it. I know when I could, I would do additional stories. If I found more evidence about the problem, I would do subsequent stories, not just because I thought it was newsworthy and warranted it, although it did, but also to keep the story alive, to make it more likely that finally something would be done. Because it's easy to ignore one broadcast, but if you keep pounding away, story after story after story, it's more likely there'll be change, but certainly not inevitable. Gee, I'm sounding pessimistic, aren't I? I mean, at least we have a society that allows it for the most part. We don't, the government does not censor us in advance. We can be punished as journalists afterwards. In the courts, we can be sued. You can get beaten up or something on the story, or pressure can be put on your bosses to have you fired. But the government will not, it cannot really, in most cases now with the internet, stop it, even if it wants to. And we saw with WikiLeaks, they had no ability to stop Julian Assange. Once the click of a mouse instantaneously around the globe, for better or for worse, those documents were out there. And the same with Edward Snowden's leaks and his documents. He's not in the audience here in Moscow, I say. I'm disappointed,
Sorry.
but not surprised.
So how did they miss that, though? I mean, that story didn't come out until he spilled the beans, right? So the people who are covering national security totally missed that? I mean, there's been a lot of hints. This guy Drake, who used to work for the NSA, he came out with a huge thing, but how did they miss that? I mean, who's covering that?
You are asking excellent questions, and you obviously know your stuff.
No, I mean journalists.
Okay, all right. So Thomas Drake was another whistleblower in the National Security Agency that is one of our intelligence agencies that does spying. And he went public, well, he didn't go public, he leaked some stuff to a reporter for the Baltimore Sun. And it was about waste in the US government. Classic whistleblowing kind of activity that we want citizens to do. In fact, we even have legislation in the US that allows whistleblowers to get a percentage of the money that they save when they expose waste and corruption by the federal government. But instead of getting any money for that, he was prosecuted. Prosecutors actually filed criminal charges to try to put him in prison. Now they ended up backing off and reaching a plea deal that required, I think, no jail time. But the guy's career is ruined. I mean, he's now working at an Apple store, giving help. I came in one day to get help with my Mac, and it was like there was Thomas Drake. And I introduced myself to him, and the guy looked really spooked because, probably usually when people go up to him, they think he's a traitor or something. And obviously that wasn't my point of view. But so, there's censorship by various means. And in more authoritarian regimes, they cut you off at the source. They just, don't allow journalists to report in the first place. They censor the news. You can argue that we have censorship by another means in the U.S. when the authorities go after the sources, the whistleblowers, for leaking information to the press. Obviously, there's genuine need for some secrets to be kept. Journalists don't report when troops are going to be moving ahead of time in wartime, or ships sailing, where the soldiers and sailors could actually be killed. But journalists aren't interested in that information. And usually national security is used as an excuse when it's really political embarrassment that's at issue. So you're asking why there isn't more of it and how did the press miss that? And I think the answer is national security is one of the hardest stories to cover. It's all smoke and mirrors, and you never know for sure what the secret agenda is of intelligence agencies that are giving you information, whether it's the CIA or the FSB or the NSA or the old KGB or Mossad or whomever. It's derivative information usually. Now there are people who've worked at the territory long enough, like Seymour Hersh, that they usually have a pretty good sense of it. But it's very hard to penetrate, and the people who run these places are very sophisticated. And that's why it's rare that we get inside a place like that when the government doesn't want us to. It's rare to have, a mid or low-level person like a Thomas Drake or a Bradley Manning or an Edward Snowden leak this kind of material. It's not uncommon for people at the top to leak, the political appointees who have an agenda. And that's what I mean about disinformation or being spun. During the run-up to the war in Iraq, the New York Times was fed a lot of disinformation and misinformation from the Bush administration about how Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't, and why he posed this great risk that needed an invasion. And that turned out to be propaganda designed for a political purpose. Was anyone ever prosecuted for leaking that false information? No, because it was sanctioned at the top.
Actually, I have a question to you. It's slightly a little bit different. Tell me for the microphone's okay.
Well, if they're taping it, it helps capture the...
Sure, right. Well, we've been talking about legislative ways of, for example, persecuting journalists, right? And citizen journalism, maybe investigative journalism. Well, I'd like to ask your opinion about something that is not frequently found here, maybe yet, but that is not frequently found in the United States, the topic of political correctness. Have you ever seen, what's your opinion on that? I'm curious whether that has been sort of method of sort of self-censorship sometimes, that you don't investigate certain things. Maybe you don't talk about certain things because they're not socially acceptable to talk about, or they're very controversial issues. What's your opinion on that? Because we don't really have too much political correctness here in Russia, if you know about that.
No, I don't imagine you do. Political correctness is a kind of ambiguous term, but I think, what we're really talking about is subjectivity versus objectivity in journalism. And there is an admirable notion that journalists should be objective in the United States, that we should report the truth fairly and impartially, and of course accurately. And that's a great goal. And I think, journalists try to do that. But we all inherently bring in our subjective prejudices, even though we try to filter them out. When we were born, what race we are, what religion, political views we have, what our childhoods were like. And some of that may lead to a political correctness or political incorrectness or various things. But ultimately, you try to filter that out. You try to just present the facts, and be as fair as you can.
But it's an issue of choosing the topics.
But it's an issue of choosing. That's exactly
right. We don't report on it. It's not an issue somebody pursuing you as much as it's unfavorable from the top. For example, if you work for a certain media company and they say, well, investigating this or portraying this might be a bad idea because it might offset certain type of people. Might get offended by this,
right.
Even though you're reporting something that is objective.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. In the choosing of the stories, there is a framing of what the issue is. And when you choose to focus on one kind of story instead of another, when you choose to ignore the Wall Street machinations, or you choose to ignore or not dig more deeply when the Bush administration leaks information about weapons of mass destruction, that is a bias. That is coming to play. And by what you choose and don't choose, you are shaping the agenda one way or the other. But the thing you have to realize about the U.S. is it's a little subtler than that. In 20 years, I don't think I ever had a boss say to me, don't do that story because it's unsafe, we don't want to ruffle the wrong feathers. They know they shouldn't say something like that. They may be thinking that, but they know better than to tell an ordinary reporter like me that. But the bosses send subtle signals that in the sociology of the newsroom you pick up on. And most reporters who aren't investigative reporters, reporters who are careerists, pick up those subtle clues and they know what not to do, what line not to cross. And I learned that with some bosses who were not very brave, the bigger the target, the more scared they were of doing the story. The good bosses, the bigger the target, the more enthusiastic they were about the story, which is the way I thought. But not all of them are that way, and that's why I say we have our own apparatchiks in the U.S., and some of them are in the news business. Sad but true. Yes?
I'm curious, you've been doing this during a period where, You've been doing this during a period where you would have seen the transition from a less digital society to a very wired society. And I'm interested in what differences you see, what influence you see the internet as having had on your work as an investigative journalist, and ways in which it has made that work easier or more likely to succeed, and ways in which it's made it perhaps harder or less likely to succeed.
Well, that's a great question because, with the digital revolution, we're seeing perhaps the biggest technological change in communication since, Gutenberg. I mean, maybe not, and it's easy to hype up, everything because every technological change mattered and did affect journalism. And certainly satellites and other communications have been huge. But, and essentially it's both good and bad. They're perhaps not surprisingly. The good parts are that both as a tool for investigative journalists, it can be terrific. It is allowing journalists from other countries to collaborate and share information, reporters from authoritarian countries to, and this, by the way, the Global Investigative Journalism Network is, thank you, you were right on cue there. You read my mind. And you can go up to the website there, gijn.org, is a group of investigative reporters from around the world who meet every couple years and share story ideas and tips and techniques, from how to use hidden cameras to how to interview people to get the truth. And they collaborate in cross-border investigations, because the same way that the bad guys don't limit themselves by nationality, journalists shouldn't either. The mafia crosses international boundaries, pollution does, the journalists need to as well. So they've done some terrific cross-disciplinary or cross-national, transnational reporting. So that's been a plus. Computer-assisted reporting, where you use databases to get information, helps you find hidden problems that might otherwise not have come up. So, even in any little county in America, you can get usually a list of all the criminals in that county, and you can cross-register it with all the school teachers and discover if maybe there's some pedophiles who are teaching kindergarten or driving your kids on the bus. I mean, just a simple example. And reporters have been doing this, so that's good. And then, besides the sort of input, there's also the output. That the web makes it harder, not impossible, but it makes it harder for governments to censor the news, for governments to repress investigative journalism. They still can do it, but it's at a cost. China has probably more censors for the internet than any country on earth, but they still can't stop it. China has this thing called Weibo, which is sort of like Twitter, but the 140 characters in Chinese apparently can convey more information than our alphabets. And so they're able to get around the censorship. They're able to use codes and slang and get around the Great Chinese Firewall, as it's called. And, with foreign server ISPs and so forth. And I'm no expert in this, since some of you, computer science, maybe know more about this than I do. So it becomes a game of cat and mouse, or maybe it's like the old Cold War where, each side keeps arming itself more and more missiles to match the other. But the point is, there is a way for it to get out. So those are all good things. And I think ultimately it will be a good thing. The bad things are the same technological tools that help journalists this way also allow governments to spy on journalists and their sources. One of the reasons the Obama administration has had more prosecution of sources than any other previous administration is because they're easier to catch now, because electronic fingerprints are left by the sources. It's easier to convict them because there's a trail, digital trail. And so the spying is easier. The other thing, and this is, maybe it's happening more in the US than in Russia or other countries, but I fear we may be setting the trend here as well, is that the economic foundation of mainstream journalism has really been crumbling because of the internet. Newspapers used to have a virtual monopoly on advertising in a city. Now they don't. You can advertise for free on Craigslist, or people can get all sorts of information for free online. They don't need to pay to buy a newspaper. And so you've got, the readership has gone down, and as the readership goes down, they can charge less for ads, and if they charge less for ads, then they have to cut their staffs, and then the readership goes down further, and it's a vicious cycle. And they're still trying to, and the same is true with television and radio. And so we haven't yet figured out a way how to monetize online advertising in a way that actually pays the bills. And investigative reporting is expensive. It's the most time-consuming, the most litigious journalism there is. So who's going to pay these journalists to take the time to dig if the economics don't supply it? And you know, really advertising has been subsidizing journalism for the last century in the US, and it's not anymore the way it used to. And people aren't, the public isn't accustomed to paying the real cost of the news gathering. So that's a real problem in the US, and maybe I'd be curious to hear what you all think about Russia in lots of different ways, but I fear that may be a growing trend elsewhere as well. Other questions? Yes, sir. Thank you.
I will try to continue the topic I started with. So we are like research institution, educational and research, and I think a lot of people here are interested in things like relations, causality, etc. And you are both practitioner and a professor. So maybe if we talk about successful investigations which led to something and less successful, maybe there are some factors which you kind of distilled over years which need to be present for some investigation, even it's, you know, convincing, etc., and outrageous, to actually lead to some changes. And if some of these few factors or checklist, I don't know, if something is not present, that's wasted time, more or less. Can you tell more about these things, like what needs to be done for investigative journal to reach the goal?
Okay. That's an interesting question. Well, I'll do the best I can. Yeah, I did get a PhD after 20 years in journalism, and so in a sense have feet in both camp of academia and journalism, and I've been teaching now for more than 10 years. And there are a lot of similarities between academia and journalism. There are also, of course, huge differences. One similarity is that in a certain sense they are both public goods. And the argument has been made in the US that the way to solve this economic problem I was just talking about is to have governments pay for journalism, subsidize journalism. And that is done more in Europe, Western Europe, than it is in the US. The BBC is funded essentially by a tax. And there's been proposals to do the same in the US, but it's been a non-starter. Congress is never going to approve that. And not just because of its sort of conservative Republican antipathy toward the news media, although there's that, but also America is a much more sort of hyper-capitalistic society, and journalists themselves, for the most part, frown on the idea of taking money from the government, and they fear censorship by the government. That whoever pays the check, calls the tune, and they don't want to be obligated to the government. All right, that's one parallel, and I just brought that up since we were talking about the economics of it. In terms of research, I mean, we really do use the same tools of research in social science research and journalism. And some of the very best journalism approaches social science research in the rigor of its methodology. And the kind of computer-assisted reporting I was talking about can do that. And there has been some tremendous work by a couple of journalists named Bartlett and Steele who have used databases to examine the tax code and show how unfair the tax code is to middle-class Americans and how the wealthy have been able to find loopholes to get around it. And it's one thing to sort of spout that as ideology or as rhetoric. It's another thing to sort of empirically demonstrate it. And they have. So I think good social scientists, like good journalists, maybe start with a hypothesis. But both have to be willing to abandon that hypothesis or modify it if the facts they gather show otherwise. And that's why bad researchers in academia and bad journalists don't do that and get themselves into trouble when they become so wedded to an idea, a hypothesis, a prejudice, that they don't change the evidence, or they bend the evidence, in the worst case, to fit that model. So I think those to me are some of the similarities. I don't know if I've answered your question. I mean, the differences, of course, is that, at least in the US, journalism is essentially, largely for profit. Academia is not, by and large. There's some exceptions, but, and so, and the public has accepted the notion of subsidizing academia in a way it has not, and probably will not ever, with journalism. But, and I'm sure there are academics who would take issue with the parallel and say that journalism is far too sloppy and to be considered on a par with academic scholarship. And there are journalists who will poke holes in the academic scholarship and say, look, you've crunched all these numbers, but have left glaring loopholes in your premise or in your, whatever. So there, can be weak methodology on both sides. And I think actually each could learn from the other, because journalists develop a very instinctive sense about people and reading people, and a sort of common sense approach that some academics might be well to study before they kind of go off on some weird tangent and invest months and years of research into something that maybe doesn't matter that much or has a flawed premise. And journalists who too often deal in anecdote rather than in sort of trends and hard evidence and hard data could learn from the academics about intellectual rigor. Olga?
And when you teach, how do you encourage students to become investigative reporters, or do you tell them something like, kids don't do investigative reporting unless you're like really, really, really ardent, and sort of like into it? Or what your encouragement for them? Like, do you tell them any success stories or like bad stories? Don't do that, like do's and don'ts, and what a journalism student should have or be to become a good investigative reporter?
Yes. No. I mean, actually, it is yes, because I do both. I tell them the good, the bad, and the ugly. I encourage them. I mean, my goodness, I'm training people who I hope will be the next generation of journalists, who will be, I hope, watchdogs for the future and expose wrongdoing by the powerful. But I also do explain, and I tell them what I believe, which is that it's a calling, really. It's a noble profession, and that you answer not to the person who signs your paycheck, ultimately, but to the public. And it's a public trust, and it is sanctioned in our Constitution and given legal protection in a way that exists in not very many countries around the world, and that we should seize upon it. And I often come back from conferences like these where journalists live in much less hospitable climates for investigative journalism, and they literally put their lives on the line. They've been thrown in prison. They've been murdered, or their colleagues have been murdered, I should say. And I think, and what are most of our journalists doing? They're doing all of this, stupid celebrity Britney Spears, coverage, or they're just, the latest speculative gossip on Capitol Hill. And it makes me feel ashamed, because we have such a system that's free, and yet we don't take advantage of it. So I say all of this to my students. I mean, heck, I'm in Russia now, and I'm trying to convince Russian students to try to do it. Although I say don't do anything that endangers your lives, trust your instincts, but I think it's important for society. And we can only be as free as we let ourselves be and we choose to be. And, the old saying is every people gets the government it deserves. I think that's a little harsh on the population, but you know, in a certain sense, we get the journalism we deserve too. And so I encourage all of my students, just as citizens, to get involved, to be active. If you don't become an investigative journalist, then leak to them when you see something going on that's wrong. Blow the whistle, do the right thing, because ultimately, this kind of journalism can improve society. It can keep things in check. It can be a self-cleansing mechanism to keep authorities, private or public, from abusing their power.
Do you think the lack of area specialists is a problem?
Is the lack of area specialists a problem? Yeah, and I think, you know, you touched on it with business reporting, and it's growing worse because, again, in the U.S., because of the economic pressures to churn out more stuff, more copy, you know, and now online, you know, hourly updates are more often, and people are spread thinner, and so that's a problem.
Yeah, I was thinking more in terms of foreign policy stuff, because, for example, Pakistan, it seems like we got played there for a good 10 years. I never saw any really good investigative journalism, because it seems like the cultural situation was just too complex for American reporters to go over there and figure it out. I didn't see much, and it seemed like that information would have been really important for the U.S. people to know.
Yeah, the question, in case not all of you could hear that, was about Pakistan and the lack of knowledge and being played, as you put it, by Pakistan. I'm not sure that is so much a fault of journalism as it is, because I feel like I've seen actually a lot of good reporting on the problem, as much as perhaps the American government's uncertainty would be the politest word I could think of in how to deal with this problem. And I don't think that the foreign policy elites in the U.S. are guided much by what journalism is doing. In fact, the journalists who are there rely on these policy elites.
Well, I mean, something like if they had come out with showing direct links between ISI and the Taliban or something like that, if that had been splashed all over the papers,
right,
people would have put pressure to change some kind of policy, but I never saw much of that until very recently.
Well, there was a lot of reporting suggesting that the ISI and factions within the ISI were pro-Taliban. Yeah, but it's very hard to get proof of that stuff. And again, we're back to smoke and mirrors. Who do you get it from? The CIA, I mean, you know, the CIA, the Mossad, I mean, are they going to give you photographs? Are they going to give you documents? How do you know whether they're forged or not? You know they have a certain agenda, you know. So, again, I agree with you, reporting should be better, but it's also inherently tricky. Investigative reporting is always harder because, you know, nobody calls a news conference to announce their own misconduct. The Pakistani intelligence services don't hold a news conference and say, we're calling this to tell you about our links to the Taliban, and here are the senior people in the ISI who are, no, you got to dig it out, and they lie, and, you know, and everybody lies. It's not just them. So it's tough, but you know, I would say that actually the bigger problem now is less internationally than it is locally, where the layoffs are affecting state capitals, the ability to investigate regulatory agencies at the state level and on the federal level. Just, you know, lack of time to cover, you know, city council meetings and mayor's offices and contracting at that level is really, you know, going unexamined. And we have newspapers actually closing shop, folding in big cities in America. And so, you know, the politicians can do a lot more, they can be a lot more corrupt without it ever being detected by the press.
Are you familiar with the press club system in Japan?
I'm not. Why don't I pass the mic to you and you can talk about it. And then we'll maybe see if anyone else has some questions.
Yes, I can.
No.
Somebody else.
No. Well, it's also for the video because they want to post this.
The press club system in Japan is the reporters cover what they are given by the government officials, and if they ask awkward questions, then they get pushed out of it's called the Kisha Club system. And there's no investigative journalism in Japan as a result, or very little. And whatever comes out from the tabloids. It seems to me, I mean, with the level of corruption in Washington, that the U.S. journalist system is kind of moving in that direction, at least in Washington, where they're afraid to offend government officials in some cases, because that's the source of a lot of what they make their,
That's interesting about Japan. I didn't know that. But, you know, all journalism reflects the culture it operates in. And that's true in Japan, I guess, and everywhere else. I am certainly very critical of the Washington Press Corps. In fact, I have a book out called Poisoning the Press that, you know, really that's one of its major themes, is how dependent really the Washington Press Corps has been on these politicians and official sources for their information. But actually it's gotten better, not worse, over the long term. If, you know, in the beginning, journalists were all on the payrolls in Washington of the political parties. And up through the early 20th century, they were moonlighting on the side and getting paid off, you know, bribed by politicians and business interests. So it's actually better than it used to be, but it's not as tough as it should. And we went through a brief period, you know, during Vietnam and Watergate and its aftermath, when the press was, you know, more adversarial than Washington, and then it, you know, got more deferential again. And that kind of happens until there's another embarrassment. And we have, you know, again, my book was about sort of this gotcha scandal culture, which investigates sex lives of politicians, but doesn't look at sort of underlying policy problems of a structural nature that are more important. And I think that gets to the whole entertainment aspect of journalism, what people read, because it's a for-profit system. You know, if people wanted substantive stories about our crumbling infrastructure instead of about Anthony Weiner's sex life as congressman and the U.S. ex-congressman you may have read about for his celebrated tweets, so to, you know, they would watch it. And so, you know, that's the thing about capitalism. It gives the audience what it wants, whether that's necessarily good or not. But yeah, it's deference to power is a terrible thing for a nation's journalistic corps to engage in. Yes?
When you're thinking about a new story, what are some of the characteristics that jump out at you or that you look for something that you think will be worth the time invested in investigating it further?
Right. Well, that's a good question. That again gets back to a little bit, so, you know, some of the same questions that an academic researcher might ask. I'm not a practicing investigative reporter anymore. Now I teach it. But you know, how original is it? How important is it? How doable is it? You know, how hard is it going to be to get corroboration? You know, whether it's eyewitness testimony, documents that back it up, maybe using hidden cameras or something, undercover reporting to go in yourself and see it. And sort of those are the elements, and it's very subjective. And, you know, of course, wherever you're working, you know, is your boss going to support you? Do they like this kind of story or not? It's a collaborative process. So those are all the things. And, you know, as an academic, there's always the so what question. Why does it matter? You want to go after stories that matter, just as you want to do research that matters. And you have to be able to prove it in a reasonable time period. And sometimes, you know, there's a lot of stories that you can't prove. You know it's true, or you strongly suspect it's true, you don't have the evidence, and you hold on to it. You gather string, as the expression goes, for a while, and then maybe there's some breakthrough. Somebody comes forward, or there's some development, some change in the landscape. And I've had that happen too, where old stories that I couldn't get on the air before, things realign, and people are willing to talk for a reason or another, and you can break it. Yes, sir.
My question is actually short. What made you change your career from being a practitioner to teaching or doing the research in academia?
Well, there's a high burnout rate, I think, doing investigative journalism, because you're fighting all the time, not just with the people you're investigating, but often with your bosses and lawyers to get the stuff out there. And I just kind of got burned out after 20 years of it. And I also, at that point, had little kids and didn't want to be traveling so much. And so academia was a good, a really good place for me. And I love it. But, emergency room, hospital personnel go through the same problem. Police, social workers do too. That kind of burnout when you're on the front lines. War correspondents, God knows, those journalists ought to burn out, although some of them become kind of addicted to the adrenaline rush. So, sure.
The bio is very intriguing, right? All these statements about being escorted by armed guards, expelled from the Vietnam. Maybe you can share some story. We've heard here from John Albert quite some stories from his experience, and they were like half funny, half very sad, and it was quite a dramatic thing. So maybe you can tell a few words about something which belongs to your story.
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. Most of what is involved in investigative journalism is actually fairly dull. Going through documents, trying to persuade people to talk to you. It's not really that glamorous. Those things happen to me, are true, and they're usually what generates people's interest. And I also tell my students it because I'm hoping it'll cut down on their whining about the grade they got by putting things in a little perspective. And there's a lot of humor, dark humor usually, but in the newsroom, as there is in an emergency room of a hospital or for police. And most of the stories are too obscene for me to be able to tell in a crowd like this, but that's precisely what makes them funny. I tell my students that the great thing about journalism is it gives you an education in life that you can never get inside a classroom, the four walls of a classroom, no matter how good the teacher is. And as you get to meet people from all walks of life who you never otherwise would meet. I had a photographer I worked with who talked about on any given day, we could go to the White House or to the outhouse, or do a story on either, and I've been to both. And I actually find outhouses, or at least the kinds of poor people who still live in those conditions, more interesting than the pre-digested press releases that come from the White House or other official organs. So I just think it's a wonderful career, at least in the U.S., at least when you're young. As you age and as you need more stability in life, maybe it's harder to have that in journalism. Before I go, I just want to show you a couple of things here on the website. The Global Journalism Investigative Network is one of them. And if you care to, and if you're interested, there's a pretty interesting story here that I just happened, by happenstance, I got to set this microphone down to do it, but it's about Crimea, since that's in the news. And in particular about how, without getting into the geopolitics of it all, how it affected news media coverage. In the U.S., there were several Americans who quit in protest working for Russian television, RT in Washington, and said that they were being pressured to put pro-Russian propaganda on the air. and they actually resigned on the air live and made statements about this, and you can Google that. So there was that, but what there also is, and I hadn't realized this, maybe you had, is that the way independent press was shut down by the Russian military when they seized control of Crimea. And there's actually some video of this that's been posted online on this website. So let me just scroll down and show it for you. Okay, so here you can see that they passed, earlier this month, journalism agency was raided, a TV broadcaster shut down, an independent journalist assaulted, her camera seized, and there's the video of the police actually, or not the police, the soldiers, storming, I guess is maybe the word, an investigative journalism center in Crimea. Yeah, stormed is the word used, at least in this report. Okay, well, it goes on for several more minutes, but I think you get the idea. And, that's obviously an intimidating thing for any journalist. And that's why I'm not here to preach that you should be journalists if it's not something you want to do, and I'm not here to insult Russia. We all have different systems, and we in America have plenty of things we have done wrong over the years. And let me just conclude, if there's no further questions, by saying, oh, we do have a question. Okay.
Well, I think
go for it.
Be able to ask it later.
No.
So, what do you think is main correspondence between the stories that catches on in this age of data overload? We all have internet, we all have received a lot of information through it, and we have to choose what to read. So what is the correspondence between the topic of your investigation and maybe the state of mind of people who read it, who share it on, maybe that is something that was pressing on, and there is some consciousness beforehand, maybe just some moral imperatives, something like that?
That's another great question. It's a little bit of a mystery to me why certain stories take off and others don't. And I think there's some randomness to it, but also not. That certain stories, if they hit at just the right moment, in just the right way, about just the right topic, are more likely to make change than other times. I can just give you a couple of examples in the U.S. And one of them is Seymour Hersh, who the man in the audience brought up. He was a young reporter in 1969 when we were in Vietnam. I'm sorry, it was a little later than that, I think 70, 71. But anyway, we was, sort of at about the apex of U.S. involvement, and about the time Americans were really starting to question our involvement in the war. It was after the Tet Offensive, but I think not hugely after it. And he wrote the story about how American soldiers were committing atrocities, killing innocent, women and children and old men who were doing nothing wrong, lighting, just shooting them in broad daylight, slaughtering them, committing war crimes. And there was a sense in the United States that this is not the kind of thing we do, we Americans. Americans like to think of themselves. I know the rest of the world, may see us as imperialists and all these other things, but Americans generally think of themselves as good-hearted, idealistic people. And they were shocked to realize that our boys were capable of doing something like this. What was this war doing that it could turn our sons into mass murderers? And just the kind of story he picked and the timing of it and the issue of it, it all came together, it all converged into a kind of mushroom cloud explosion that had a dramatic impact on turning public sentiment against the war in Vietnam. And there are just certain, moments in history when the right reporter with the right story at the right time can do that. And maybe it doesn't happen often enough, but that it happens at all is a good thing. And the rest of the time you gotta, when you're a reporter, just keep slugging away, because you never know when that time's going to come. You never know the one story you do is actually going to really make a difference. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who were Washington Post reporters, they didn't know when they first started covering this break-in at the Watergate headquarters of the Democratic Party that it would, ultimately set in motion a chain of events that would, lead to the resignation and disgrace of our president. And I'm not saying that they caused it, but you just don't know where things are going to lead. And that's why you need an independent and free press plugging away, because somebody's got to watch these folks. So, on that note, I guess, if there's no more questions, thank you all for coming. And for those of you, from Russia, let me just say, I think all of our people, all people in all countries want more or less the same thing for their families: health, economic security. Governments may fight, and right now we're, at a time of tension over Crimea between our governments, but there's no reason why people can't be friends, and I hope our peoples are always friends with each other. So, go